Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the debut album from Courtney Barnett. Sometimes I sit and think, sometimes I just sit. Now, I've mentioned in the past that I'm not really a fan of tween music that emphasizes willful immaturity and cuteness and normalcy for its own sake. Part of it is the aesthetic. Bubblegum pop can work really well when it's done right, for example, but the general aesthetic and atmosphere of that kind of twee sound kind of turns me off. Part of it is I've got a flair for the bombastic and dramatic. I like power metal, for God's sakes, but I reckon it runs a little deeper than that, because it's not like I don't like regular, down-to-earth, very human stories. Hell, I listen to country music, and I praised artists like Jason Eady who pull inspiration from the most mundane of details. But to me, the combination of a willfully immature tone and sound and an approach to go for a more mundane or twee approach lyrically, I'm sorry, just kind of turns me off. And it seems like a lot of this music really coasts by on relatability, whereas a critic, things get kind of tricky. I'm not going to deny that there is a factor to being able to relate to an artist or a sound that influences why a lot of people like it. It lends a degree of authenticity to the experience for the listener. But I'd argue there should be more than that. For me, the best artists that can make that connection with their audience regardless of the stories that they're trying to tell. On the other hand, I tend to react pretty negatively when artists try to elevate the very mundane into something that connect with their audience and maybe along the way might make it mean something. Even coming from me, it smacks of pretentiousness, a cheap way to connect with an audience without the imagination to push more boundaries or get to a more emotive, vulnerable material. And considering so much of it doesn't even try to go for bigger drama, it strikes of trying to find something very, very powerful and striking when there really isn't much there to begin with. As such, I had a real sinking feeling going in to cover Courtney Barnett, Australian singer-songwriter who's won a lot of critical acclaim for her embrace of fragments of 90s grunge, garage rock, and hints of a very mundane lyricism. Her debut follows two very well-received EPs, and this looks to me her most critically acclaimed record to date. As such, I'm almost obliged to cover it while I work through the back catalogs of Laura Marling and Swiftjan Stevens to review their albums. And even though I expected this would not be my thing at all, seems to be the theme of this week, I've had to give it a fair chance. Part of my goals this year would be covering music that's outside of my usual comfort zone. So, with all that, how is sometimes I sit and think, and sometimes I just sit? Well, to my surprise, I did get something out of this album, and in a strange way, it's not really because of the album's content itself. No, the odd connection I got with this record came from an entirely different work, and indeed an entirely different medium. Television. Because the thought that struck me midway through this album and just would not leave, it's this. If the character Jessa from HBO's Girls ever made an album with any vestige of self-awareness, it would be Courtney Barnett, Sometimes I Sit and Think, Sometimes I Just Sit. Now, does this realization make the album any good? Well, again, on some level, it's not exactly my thing, so it's kind of hard to evaluate, but the more I listened through it, the more I found myself fascinated by this odd connection that at least allows me to understand some dimension behind it, even though I don't exactly think it's a great record. So okay, to explain all that, I need to give you some background on HBO's Girls, and Jessa in particular. You might have seen the early promos for Girls saying that the showrunner and lead, Lena Dunham, was the voice of our generation or some nonsense like that. But as an evaluation of Gen Y, she's not exactly far off. Underemployed, overeducated, more outwardly self-absorbed, completely disdainful of career, half because we're terrified we'll end up like our parents, and half because we're not getting anything close to stable employment these days. It's the me generation, crafted by an entire group of parents telling their children they were special and perfect and they can do anything, and then not being able to really back it up when confronted with reality. Now, the character of Jessa comes from an offshoot of that, the sort of faux bohemian who has spent her life traveling, doing hard drugs, having lots of sex, then cutting and running when things start getting too real. You've all had this friend in some capacity. On some level, the worldliness and free spirit is attractive, even enviable, but the longer you're around this person, the more you start to find them kind of insufferable for their complete inability to face the consequences and somehow managing to get by or even prosper more than you. Quote Kevin Smith, failing upwards. And you know, Lena Dunham on some level, she gets this, showing Jessa's life careen from drug-fueled parties and concerts to failed relationships and rehab centers, and this slow toll it's taken on her psyche, all of which she is actually self-aware of and terrified of facing the reality of it all. Now, how does all of this relate to Courtney Barnett at all? Well, as I said, the more I listened through this album, the more I saw the direct parallel between the way Jessa is framed on Girls and what she might write and Barnett's writing, which really does take center stage on this record, be above instrumentation or production or even her own delivery, which drifts back and forth between fast-paced spoken word and gracefully riding the melody, or at least somewhat. And I'll give her this, there's some really strong technical songwriting on display here, in terms of structuring cadence and flow and cramming so many details in her writing to really set the scene and describe it. So what's this album trying to say? Well, as I said, it's as if Jessa's brand of self-aware, underhanded snark bled into many of these songs. The first and most aggressively abrasive example being Pedestrian at Best, where she's sick of being put on a pedestal and proceeds to explode into a self-flagellating, passive-aggressive mess. And even if she is addressing the audience or the industry, as some people claim, she doesn't exactly help her situation. She doesn't look good here. It makes the argument that she shouldn't be on that pedestal. And it's not the first time this album descends into self-absorbed self-deprecation in order to disguise her terrible or stupid behavior. Her simmering anger and petty sniping on small poppies for little adequately explained reason. Her attempt to impress somebody swimming in a lane next to her where she nearly drowns in Aqua Profunda, which honestly, I did not find that cute at all. Her incessant indecisiveness about going out to have fun and nobody really cares if you don't go to the party, or even the title seems to be mocking her in that, or the jaded depression of Debbie Downer. And when it's not being aggressively abrasive, at least to me, it's inane, like the petulant whine of Elevator Operator where the protagonist blows off work to engage in the simplest of dreams of playing God, or the rambling of An Illustration of Loneliness, Sleepless in New York, where there is some interesting imagery surrounding loneliness that could have had impact, but basically boils back to just a standard track pining for an ex. Now, to be fair, much of the framing does seem to highlight that Courtney's behavior isn't exactly a good thing. It's reckless, it's petty, it's self-obsessed, and it's directionless. And when this album chooses to take a step back and take more of a breath and actually tackle something that's a little bit more real, it can cut a little bit deeper. Depreston, for instance, talks about a move out to the suburbs and the loss of individual flavor to gentrified anonymity and the inevitability of conventional adulthood. It hits a lot harder for me. Or the depression of Kim's Caravan, where there are fragments of suicidal tendencies on that song that try to underline the depression underscoring this record. And she reads about parts of the world that end up being far worse off, and then she reconsiders that choice. Hell, with the ending track, Boxing Day Blues, where she admits she doesn't have a clue what the hell she's doing, and she's frustrated with people obsessed with the idea of her, in love with that idea. You can make the argument that this album is basically a long-form examination of her depression, or at least the framing is suggesting that. And you know what? Here's where things get kind of tricky, because I can have a lot of empathy for those going through depression. I understand that. How their behavior is influenced by a chemical imbalance and how the things they might say or do might not reflect their true intentions. I can empathize with that. It's clear the album is framing it to utilize that empathy and make Courtney at least somewhat relatable to the audience. But it doesn't excuse all of their behavior, and when you get such a lengthy display of passive aggression with so much of it feeding into her world, it's hard to get invested in her beyond just the relatability factor, which for me is not enough. And it gets even harder when you have tracks like Dead Fox. You're just trying to express very real exploitations of the environment by corporations, but there's no conviction to any of Courtney's small-scale protests. She seems aware that said messages, they matter on some level. This is a real problem, but why should the audience buy into them when it's so clear that it's so half-hearted for her that she doesn't care? It's one of the things that really bugs me about this album, because it brushes up against reality and real issues that can drive potent drama, even if they are very, very small just for her. I'm not asking for deeper existential meanings. I don't think Courtney's even trying to give them. I think she's actively fighting against that. But she would rather deflect and focus on her character's very small and very inane point of view, which honestly is a lot harder to stomach given that particular character, and it does a disservice to the actual issues that she tries to discuss. I just can't buy them when it's coming from her. Now, granted, it could all feed into the overall arc of Courtney needing to figure out what's wrong with her or what's going on with her and find some clarity and get her shit together. But like our protagonist, this album would prefer to avoid that conversation entirely. And you know, all of that could make for a very interesting exploration and a great album if the actual music and performance was anything special. And when it takes so much of a backseat to the lyrics, the songs become more memorable for any of the words than any particular melody or groove. It just kind of runs together. For an album claiming to pull a lot from garage rock, it's nowhere close to being abrasive or lo-fi, and only fragments of a guitar tone and some washed out reverb suggest any sort of psychedelic influence. Most of this record, it plays as very, very safe. On most of these tracks, the most interesting thing is how some of the guitar melodies interweave with each other, but the bass tone's very muddy and guitar licks that could have had more of an edge and more impact, like on Pedestrian at Best or Dead Fox, they bleed together in a surprisingly unflattering way. Now, it's not saying that there aren't melodies that stick in your head or even some good hooks, but if you compare them to, say, X-Hex's more defined riffs and hooks, or Slater Kinney's more ragged textures, the indulgent sides of the instrumentation on this album, they start to show through. Small Poppies is probably the most egregious example, where I actually like the distant squealing solos as the song proceeded until they kind of stopped evolving more to compensate for the underwritten lyrics over the course of 7 minutes. Now, Kim's Caravan, it is better, if only because there's some ominous creaking swell and a washed out crescendo that builds into a pretty potent wall of noise that I did like, but still, nearly 7 minutes, and that ending, like many of the songs on this album, especially the half-formed Aqua Profunda, it feels abortive. It doesn't really come together. I do like more of the country flavor of Depreston, but if I'm being honest, it's nothing that Lydia Loveless or Lucette haven't done a lot better in the indie scene. And with few exceptions, most of the instrumental tones in this album are very bright and a lot more upbeat, which tonally just does not complement the lyrics very well. And when you have songs where it barely seems like Courtney gives a damn, why should the audience? I get she's depressed, but there needs to be something to hook me in here. Look, I get why people might find this record charming or engaging, and I'm not denying she does have talent as a songwriter in a very technical sense. But coming back to the girls example, the appeal of this album, it lies entirely if you can find Courtney Barnett's character charming or relatable. And if I'm being honest, there's a reason that Girls is focused not on Jessa, but on Hannah, who actually has drive and goals, even if her expectations and ego are wildly out of balance. Because Jessa's character only ever got interesting on Girls when she was forced to confront reality. And I can say the exact same thing about this album. And while we get snippets of the underlying emotion that drove the better parts of this record, the underwhelming and very safe instrumentation and delivery, coupled with lyrics that walked the line of insufferable and frequently crossed it, the album just got exasperating for me to listen through. And self-deprecating framing and hints of more below the surface, they don't really cut it when the album would prefer to engage in trite, ordinary, mundane moments that really add up to a lot less than the sum of its parts. So you know what, for me, it's a strong 5 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you find the character of Courtney Barnett interesting or this brand of twee-flavored music workable. I sure as hell don't. This album, prime reason why, but hey, it's not for everyone. So if you like this sort of thing, check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to get them a listen. Yes, Laura Marling and Swift Jan Stevens, they're coming. I'm working my way through the discographies. I really want to make sure I get it. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.